This is the Mobile Tech Podcast, brought to you by worldpodcasts.com. Now here's your host, Tech Girl, Miriam Joie.
Brought to you by Esper. Hi, and welcome to the Mobile Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Miriam Joie, and today is Friday, April 15th, 2022. And my guest is the awesome David Ruddock of Esper, hence sponsored by Esper. Hi, David. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well, and this is my first time ever being like a talking head on a show, so this will be fun for me.
You can do it. It's all good.
I can do it.
Guide us through what you want to talk about, because you and I talked a few times now about some of the cool stuff you guys that do at Esper. I'm actually really excited to find out more. So what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so the way I put it to people, especially if you're familiar with the smartphone space, is we're really in what I would call the hidden world of Android, which is all these Android devices that you probably don't see every day or think about, really. You probably do see a lot of them, actually, but you're probably not thinking about them. And what do I mean by that? Like, how many devices really are out there running Android that aren't like phones or tablets, right? And the answer is actually so many. You wouldn't believe how much stuff is out there running Android every single day.
Surprise us, David. Come on.
Yeah. So, I mean,
what is there?
we're talking hundreds of millions of devices globally, but in terms of types of devices, it could be like anything from, you might consider kind of boring, but like point of sale devices. It's extremely popular for essentially modern cash registers. It's very modern for customer service or self-service kiosks in a customer,
so
like in
McDonald's,
an airport.
Right?
Yeah, sure. I don't know what McDonald's is running, but that idea. Totally.
That idea. What about Square point of sales, not the actual iPads people use,
right,
converted, but the actual genuine Square. Are those Android or what are they custom OS? Do you know?
They're based on AOSP. And most of these things are, because there's a real good reason for that. I think you probably would guess by now. It's free and open source. So, I mean, that tends to get people's attention, right? Well, it's like it's an operating system. Somebody's putting it out there, somebody being Google, and they're putting it out there ostensibly for free. So it's made it really attractive to a ton of different industries. And I mean, we're in a bunch of different ones. So you could be talking about in-vehicle infotainment. Tons of cars run in-vehicle infotainment OSs based on AOSP, not even true Android. There are tons of pieces of fitness equipment. So Peloton runs based on AOSP. Believe it or not, they're on Android Nougat still. So, yeah, exactly. And we actually have a customer called Climber who make essentially what I would call the Peloton of climbing machines, and they run based on AOSP. We have a customer called Ciata. They make two-way cellular walkie-talkies for first responders. Those are on AOSP.
Talked about this when you were on my show like a few weeks ago.
Yes.
That is so cool.
It is. It's really, the different form factors. Literally, we have a walkie-talkie with a monochrome LED 0.8-inch screen it doesn't even have a user interface to speak of. That is an information readout. And then we have probably 600-pound climbing machine that also runs Android and that we also manage. And you're probably thinking, okay, well, what's the commonality here aside from operating system? And there is one, and we'll get there. But first, I'd love to, talk a little bit more about what does Android actually mean in this context, because that's a much different question, I think.
I think a lot of people just think, Google's flavor Android, or maybe if they're a little further down the, the nerdiness level, they'll be like, the Chinese are running non-Google sanctified versions of Android on their, phones. Like a good example is Huawei with Harmony OS, which we all know is Android AOS with stuff on it. So beyond that, where do we go from there?
So when you're talking about these kinds of devices, like a climbing machine, like this weird two-way walkie-talkie, or when you're talking about a cash register even, the things these devices need to do what they do every single day are really different from what your smartphone does. It doesn't matter if your smartphone's in China or the US. We're talking about devices that functionally are just very different in the way people interact with them. So they're not opening up a browser. They're not checking their email. They're not, going into settings and turning Wi-Fi on and off necessarily. Not to say they couldn't do that. But the idea is they're unitaskers. They're meant to do one thing all day, every day. That Square point of sale is meant to process transactions all day. That is what it's meant to.
Keep a record and be secure.
Right.
And interface on the networking level, a bunch of other products probably, which is why you can't just use the L word.
Right. And that is a big part of it because
Linux.
I mean that is for those of you who didn't get that one, but it's that is a huge challenge that comes with it. But the reason these devices don't run what Google would call Android, because Google, their version of Android, and not version, the definitive Android has Google services. That is how Google defines Android as a term, as a brand, as a product. Now, once you remove those Google services, you don't have Android anymore. You have the Android Open Source Project, or AOSP. Now, that is what most of these things are built on, like Peloton. Peloton's built on top of AOSP. But that means you're missing a bunch of things that Google otherwise would provide. And the most common ones to understand from a consumer perspective are things like push notifications. Like your phone gets push notifications because of this thing called Firebase, which is a developer tool published by Google that allows app developers to basically talk to a Google server that serves you app notifications from the cloud. Believe it or not, your phone is not serving you notifications like directly. They are coming down from a server somewhere that is sending a package and saying, hey, you got a notification. So if you were to, for example, install the Gmail app on a phone running AOSP without Play services, without Google stuff on there, but you tried to install Gmail, well, Gmail wouldn't get any notifications, most likely. A lot of other things probably wouldn't work either. The app might not even boot up, most likely, depending on which APKs you've installed. So there are a lot of things, like even weirder stuff, like Android doesn't have, or AOSP doesn't have a stock time server set. Like, so you have to configure your own time server.
Okay.
Like, just very random things, right? Like the kind of stuff you might expect to hear if you were building your own Linux distro, which in many ways you are if you choose to go with AOSP. The difference, of course, being that AOSP has an extremely mature silicon vendor ecosystem, an extremely mature app developer ecosystem, and a device ecosystem that is truly massive. It has scale. Right. So there are great tools to build things to do a lot of this. But if we go back to this kind of like our climbing machine or our weird walkie-talkie handset, well, in a lot of cases, Google doesn't even clearly define those as being compatible with its services suite. Not to say that they aren't, but that even getting them certified for GMS, which is what it's called, Google Mobile Services, would be a pretty big challenge. Not to mention just the challenge of actually doing it financially and resource-wise, but time. Certification with Google takes time. And what do you get out of that certification at the end of the day? Well, you get the ability to use all of those cool Google developer tools, which are really great for certain app experiences. And I say certain app experiences. In our world, they often aren't useful. And so you might have something, the most important thing you get out of that, though, and that's where we really step in, is the ability to distribute software updates
I was just going to say
core
that.
application experience via the Google Play Store. And that is really why most companies, even in the corporate world, might want to use Google Mobile Services because, hey, that's the app store that's scaled for billions of devices. It's going to be reliable.
It's a known entity too, right?
Exactly. So. And, they probably are already publishing apps on the Play Store themselves, whether they're corporate apps or they might be consumer-facing marketing apps. It's depends on the business. But when you start going through that process, you run into all those delays, those costs, those complications. Your device may not even be a suitable target for GMS at the end of the day. The Seattle mobile handset, probably not a suitable GMS target.
No.
Wouldn't make sense. So the reason you still might do it, though, is because you're saying, okay, with AOSP, I don't have a way to deliver any updates to my application that aren't fully manual. I would have to deploy from my own cloud. I would have to send the update. I would have to come up with the communication line, essentially.
Yeah, and then the security issues around that, managing the servers, managing the cost of hosting. Yeah. I mean, it's a freaking can of worms.
Yeah, and it's in these businesses where the cost of creating the product and supporting it are so important, you can't just say, well, just put GMS on it, it will be fine. There are very concrete costs and complications you're introducing there that could not necessarily, I wouldn't want to say scuttle a product, but that could really, increase the difficulty of launching it at all.
Right.
And in many cases, you're paying for either in technical, debt or in terms of actual money, you're paying for features that you're just never going to probably
it comes with a lot of baggage. I'm thinking of that talkie-walkie thing. And you're like, no, there's not even barely a display there. There's so much stuff you don't even need, right?
Right. And the reason Google does this, though, and they have really good reasons for this, is they want to keep that smartphone ecosystem from fragmenting too much. And they also want to make sure the same's true of wearables, in tablets, and televisions, and soon to be cars, which is all really good. But these are consumer-facing devices, and they're meant to run any number of applications at any one moment. So they're just totally different. Whereas like these other devices we're talking about, like a point of sale, it runs the same app all day. You don't even have to worry about a home screen because it's never going there. It's just running this application all day. And so the needs are different for one. And for another thing, the way these devices evolve, which, Miriam, you're probably familiar, is like from KOSU, really that concept of embedded computing, these corporate owned single-use devices where you think about it as like you are buying a computer in the way somebody buys a washing machine. It is a durable asset.
Yes, totally.
But that's totally changing now because everything's getting served via the internet or some level of internet connectivity and personalization and a whole host of other factors, sensor data, machine learning, algorithms that looking at your assets that way, like your point of sale, your cash register, as that fixed washing machine is probably not a good business strategy.
No,
right?
It doesn't make sense anymore.
No, you want to be able to update it. You want to be able to evolve it. Well, the other thing you end up running into, though, is because you're working with this culture of like, embedded computing assets a lot of times, people are very afraid of updating these systems.
Well, yeah, they're mission critical. Like for a business,
exactly.
McDonald's, you work, assuming it's not open 24 hours, you fire it up in the morning, it better be working and online because otherwise you don't get your ice cream. Remember the ice cream fiasco at McDonald's?
Oh, yes. The McFlurry fiasco. So that is, that's the phrase we use. And I love that you bring it up. Mission critical is exactly how we describe all of our customers. If their devices were to stop working, a core part of their business doesn't work. So in the case of point of sale, you can't collect money.
Which is probably the biggest thing you need to do.
Right. Is the most mission critical. In the case of Climber, you can't exercise on your exercise machine. Like this is like a big problem. Like, for example, if you were to have that exercise machine in a gym and then you're like, okay, well, I can't actually deliver the value I'm promising to my customer. But I don't want to get too corporate with it. But to say like there's obviously a demand for these devices out there for these, and AOSP is the platform people have chosen because it is super technically robust out of the box. It's very adaptable, has a wonderful, wonderful wireless connectivity stack that Linux does not, quite frankly.
Yeah, I can say that again.
You have cellular modem connectivity out of the box in Android. Like, could you imagine? So it's so fully featured. The developer ecosystem is so big. It's hard to, it is the largest developer ecosystem now. Android is. And so the thing that happens, though, is that because you have all these cost concerns and because Android ends up being chosen as like, well, it's the best, it's also the minimum viable product in a lot of respects for a lot of these companies, and they're just trying to get something out there. Well, corners start getting cut. One of the biggest corners is that you end up buying a system. Let's say you're a restaurant and you have 1,000 stores and you want to buy 5,000 points of sale. Well, you might go to your vendor and they might have an Android or AOSP based point of sale, but it might be running on like Android Oreo. And the reason for that is they don't have any motivation to update it. It still works as designed initially 5 years ago or whatever, 4 years ago. And as far as they're concerned, we don't want to update it because that means we have to work with the silicon vendor to do that, which is probably not possible. You might just be running silicon so old that you just can't update it.
You can't get updates.
Very common. You would be shocked. Or it could just be, well, this is an OEM that could, be out of business 2 years from now, and they just aren't interested in long-term support. And so all these companies then realize, well, my actual devices are not getting updates. The technology that underpins them is oftentimes out of date itself. How do I solve this problem? Like, how do I start managing all of these things? Because I'm introducing like probably different versions of Android. And the solution they went for was the solution we use to manage corporate smartphones, basically, which is called MDM, mobile device management. Okay. And these systems were designed for like, you have like a work profile on a smartphone. So the data is totally segregated. It lives in its own secure partition, essentially, on Android or iOS so that you can still follow your corporation's data policies, essentially, is what that's all about. So these tools were designed to control those sorts of devices. Now, you could control them on a very deep level if it was actually a corporate-owned smartphone, and you were like, for example, giving it to a high-level executive, and that is their phone for like calling the board. Like, it is something you want to lock down. Right, exactly. But these tools were designed for these multitask, end user kind of general purpose computing devices. They weren't designed to update them. They weren't designed to deliver software to them, because why would you? Like that already exists. It's called the Google Play Store. It's called the iOS App Store. For Windows, there obviously is the Windows Store, but all of these things fall under MDM. It could be a laptop, it could be a tablet, it could be a phone. And these MDM tools, well, they stepped up to start managing these dedicated systems, and we call these dedicated devices. Kosu, dedicated device, Unitasker, any of these things I've named, the Seata handset, the Climber machine, they're all dedicated devices. They do that one thing all day, every day. But these MDM tools for managing these devices, you might be able to pull all these devices into a console or something, and you can see them all. But in terms of what you can actually accomplish and the reliability of that system, it's not going to make you confident in your ability to do any of those things. Like, for example, let's say you have a point of sale and you run a restaurant and you want to update it seasonally, just to update like placement of menu items, because it's going to make your checkout folks faster if you shortcut like the things that are popular seasonally. You have the data. You can do this. Like, you can make this decision probably with a high degree of confidence. But actually getting that software to all 5,000 of those point of sale terminals is shockingly difficult in most of corporate America. You would think that, with the internet being everywhere, this would be a solved problem. It is not by any stretch of the imagination.
No, I know. I can imagine. I mean, some companies, don't even connect these devices to the internet as we know it, right?
Yeah. And I mean, we only deal with internet connected stuff. If it doesn't talk to the internet, we're not interested in it. But realistically, like, even these internet connected devices that have probably been connected to the internet for well over a decade at this point, like point of sale, they've all been on like the internet for ages now. Right. But nobody wants to update them because of two basic reasons. Number one, they're afraid they're going to break something. And if they do break something, that probably means a human being has to go somewhere to fix it. And that is the worst case scenario. If you're in IT, if you're in operations, you just don't want to you don't want to get in that situation. Now imagine that it broke something, but it broke it in a highly distributed way across an entire country. And you're like, okay, I need to get every regional manager and I need to figure out like a strategy around how to fix this. Now, that is a breakage situation. Even in a planned deployment, you might still be sending people to stores to do things, because you might say, well, this store based on our data is very unreliable. Like their hours aren't as like, they're not open as much, or maybe the internet connectivity situation is very bad and it's not stable enough to get the update there. But even sending the update in the first place, the best you usually get with these quote MDM solutions is a big red button that says send this software. Right? Exactly. And then you just kind of
click.
There's no feedback. The ability to observe what's happening is essentially non-existent. And you honestly, most of the time have no way of knowing if you succeeded until somebody somewhere says, I either got it or I didn't. And you still have to have somebody saying that. So this is the problem we solve really well.
This is what Esper does.
Basically, where Esper steps in is when companies start to realize, wow, it's really hard to deploy software to these devices. It's really hard to consistently manage them. And also, I have no idea what version of software I'm running or what that means in terms of a device's capabilities. We really step in there and can change the game completely, because we are designed to be a single pane of glass to manage these devices, update them, including for devices that run our own distribution of AOSP called Foundation. We can provide them security patches and OS upgrades. We can even run our operating system on x86 Intel platforms, which is a really cool thing. We're the only ones.
We should talk about that sometime on the show.
I think we will.
On another show. But I want to ask you something. So does that mean that, say I have a point of sale, I have an op running, and you guys are managing it with your awesome platform, can I do that change from the seasonal, but without actually having to deploy an entire new APK. Like, do you have an ability to update the settings for that app so that the next time it starts up, it's got new, because you don't want to just ship a new APK for that. Like, you know what I'm saying? That's probably a config file somewhere that shows the layout of the menu. Why not just change the config file and not change the APK, which would be silly. That's what I wanted to talk about.
We can do that. So one of the ways we do that, you're probably familiar with JSON. JSON is the standard configuration format for everything in Android, essentially.
Exactly, yeah.
So through our management platform, you can literally go in there and say, I want this app to deploy on this subset of devices, whatever you've defined it as based on region, based on what kind of device, OS version. And you can say, I want to attach this JSON configuration file to this deployment. Now, if you didn't change the APK, but you did change the JSON file, bam, that JSON file is going to get updated. We're going to push it. And the next time that app starts, which you will have to restart the app, of course, when the configuration file gets changed. Otherwise, I think you'd have some issues. But once it restarts, you've got the new configuration there. You didn't have to deploy this 50 megabyte app update. Now, many customers are fine doing that, but it just goes to show like that flexibility. You would never get that with an MDM. You can't even do that with Google. That's not something the Play Store can do because
I don't think it changed settings.
No, giving developers that kind of power would probably be problematic in a lot of ways for end users on something like a smartphone. And that's really, I think, the message I hope that, everybody who's listening would take away here is that when you're talking about the kind of devices we are, Android and what you need it to do and what you're trying to accomplish are so different. And all of these concerns you might have in the consumer smartphone kind of situation, a lot of them just go away in this dedicated device world. I mean, can you imagine a world in which your phone manufacturer could remote into your device at any time and share the screen and control it? No, of course not. And they shouldn't have that power. Why would they? But if you are a corporation and you own a cash register and you need to get in there and see what's going on with it because it's not behaving, you just need to be able to do that with a click. And we offer that. So it just goes to show, I think that the philosophy and the way you approach things is so different. You need a partner who actually understands, okay, here's how we use Android the right way to accomplish what it is you want to do. And that's what Esper is here for, whether you just want it on the management side and software deployment, or if you want to go much deeper and actually start using our distro, our operating system to add even more features, more configurability, more security to your systems. And if you're curious about that, we're at esper.io and, you can book a demo with us. Our sales team is happy to talk with anyone and everyone. So, and honestly, if you're just intrigued, if you're personally intrigued, reach out to me on Twitter. I'm at RDRV3. I will chat your ear off about dedicated devices and AOSP. It's become my favorite thing.
No, I think honestly, I've been fascinated, but you and I have had conversations kind of side channeling around this stuff. And I'm just really into it because I just feel like it's just like this hidden universe that we are all touching every day, but that does so much important stuff.
Very much
and I
so.
know that my audience is a bunch of nerds who will get into this. Not only that, but I also, hopefully somebody's listening that has a problem to solve and you might be able to solve it with Esper. So there you go. 2 birds, 1 stone. So thanks, David, for being on the show yet again, and this time in a different way. Hopefully we'll talk again about Esper in the context of that x86 stuff you had mentioned, because I think that's really, really cool.
I'm very excited about that. And as a teaser, I'm pretty sure I will have a video we can play of us taking a Windows cash register and turning it over to Android, essentially, no hands.
Like a Pentium 100 MMX or something from 1998.
I think the instruction set might have changed a little too much on that one.
A little bit. All right. Well, thanks so much, David. And folks, we're going to continue with Lance. So, Lance, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Thanks for joining the madness that is my show. So, hey, we've got a bunch of topics that I want to kind of pick your brain about. Some of the stuff you recently wrote on Tech Radar, actually. Because, there's a lot of stuff we cover that is news and reviews, and we kind of get down into the facts of like this phone and that phone. Right. But I love your opinion pieces. And I'm not just saying that because you're my editor-in-chief. I just want to clear that out for everybody out there. I don't actually work with Lance very much, folks, directly anyway. So I just feel like, that nothing one phone story you wrote was really interesting, and also your story on the Apple Pro, Pro branding.
Right.
So I want to touch on that, and then we got some news for the week, stuff that is from China, stuff that is more local. I just want to go through it all with you. So tell me a little bit, what was your feeling, your initial gut kind of vibe when you heard all this weird presentation we got from Carpe about the Phone 1?
I think anybody who's been in this industry long enough has an aversion to hype, right? We've all occasionally been caught up in it. But we're all, the term vaporware is not something I made up. It's been around for a long time. And look, he's already, Carpe is already poking us with the name, right? Nothing.
Yes.
I mean, it's like, it's nothing, but it's something. Well, no, it's not something until it is something. And we have, so he holds this event, which people seemed okay with the fact that he wasn't going to show anything, even though I think they, in their heart, felt that maybe he would finally reveal this phone, this exciting phone.
Yeah, I think we all kind of hoped there'd be a little more than what he gave us, right?
Yeah, I think that's what people thought. Also because there'd been that leak maybe a week earlier where he'd been spotted somewhere and he was holding something in his hands and they're like, that's the phone, even though...
Oh, is that MWC? I had Don McQuire on my show not long ago from Qualcomm. He said, that was my feet.
Isn't that funny? Yeah. I was in that photo, but it didn't even look like a phone what he was holding, but fine. There's this idea of a transparent phone. Here's the problem. What Carpe has to deliver has to be extraordinary in order to one, live up to the promises, and two, capture the imagination of consumers who basically understand what they want in a phone now. And why are all phones becoming alike? Because the set of features and utilities and tools and cameras that we want and the size of the screen, it's all sort of known. And we've come to this place where, yes, a lot of these phones look the same. And maybe that's a little boring, but they work, and they work really well.
Exactly. And they set expectations for us. Like,
right.
If you use a device like that doesn't have those things, you will notice immediately.
Of course. Or if they don't, there's a level, right? There's a benchmark for how these phones are supposed to perform. You better meet that benchmark and then possibly go above it. But the understanding with consumers is that if they don't spend as much money, they'll get sort of a certain level of performance, even though they'll get the way things should be, but they maybe won't have as powerful a processor. They'll have a 12 megapixel camera or 10 megapixel instead of a 50 megapixel. Like they get the trade-offs. But here's Carpe, who worked for OnePlus, right? Basically was one of the founders of OnePlus, which is, by the way, one of my favorite phone companies, especially before the most recent phones, because they were always doing something unique, interesting before other people. Didn't always work, but they took some big swings. The pop-up camera, that was crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. We're actually going to talk about some news items that I think kind of has me excited again a little bit. Also, I think I will link to your article about the OnePlus 10 Pro Lite painting that you did. We're not going to dive into that because there's a bunch of phones in the past that support it. But it's really cool that a lot of people don't know that you can do that.
Right. And to be fair, there's a lot of, if you can, some of the other cameras out there make long exposure a little bit harder than that. But going back to what nothing is doing here, which is nothing, what is going to be the thing? It's not ready. We are not ready technically. The technology is not ready for a fully transparent phone. And especially, one of the things I pointed out in the story is that one of the big fundamental blocks here is the battery, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Open up a phone. You can't open up an iPhone too easily, but you can open up many Android phones, at least previous ones. The biggest thing in there is this battery that covers 1/3 to half of the back, right? Because we've got 500 millihour amp batteries, and so they need a lot of space. So he's got to deliver a battery that's at least 4,500 or above. It's got to take up a lot of space. So what's the point of a so-called transparent phone? So much of this bothers me because it doesn't make sense. But I am somebody who is a slave to innovation. Show me something spectacular and you will turn me around. I just don't believe that's what's going to happen here.
I think my gut feeling on this, having played with the earbuds, which are, by the way, on my desk here, very dusty now because I haven't used them in a while. Oops. But I'll show you to the audience because we have patrons watching this on Patreon right now, the video version of the podcast. Folks, if you want the video version, patreon.com/TNKGRL comes out a little earlier and you get the kind of more like less edited, more personal aspect of the show. But I feel like you look at these and how they're made, and it's not about the transparency. It's more about, the components are all there. They take up all the space they expect to take. And it's more like you have a hint of transparency implied by the fact that not every tiny bit of space is used up. And I think just the fact that the acrylic shell exists itself gives it a transparent kind of depth to it, right? And I think that if they can deliver that, I think it'll be good enough. Kind of like what RedMagic has done on their gaming phones, where they have a transparent back on some devices. It's glass, but you can see that there's basically a sticker applied below it, right? And the sticker implies circuitry and it's fake. But I'm not sure if they'll do fake because on the earbuds, it's not fake. You can clearly see the circuit board has been painted black at the factory. The thing that I think is the most of an achievement on here is that there's no glue seams of any kind. Like if they used some kind of glue to put this together, it's not visible. And I think that's what I think is going to be interesting about this OnePlus phone. I think I'm expecting just a normal phone with some transparent hints, but no way of clearly seeing how you can open it.
Great.
Which I think is, yeah, right?
I fix it to me like, this is terrible.
No, OneFix is going to give it a 0 or 1 or something. But I think the thing is, that's kind of what I expect. But what I'm more taken aback, and honestly, I just expect to be like OnePlus Nord. I expect like a mid-range, the one we didn't get in the US, not the watered down N series. I think we're going to get something like a $500-ish pseudo flagship that's very competitive, has all the right ingredients, and because it's made of plastic, inherently, because it's transparent, I think they can do some cost cutting there. Although the manufacturing is a challenge, but if they can nail that, and clearly they did with the earbuds. But what really tweaked me about that thing is like, we want to create an ecosystem and compete with Apple. And I'm like, no, that's never going to happen. I don't care what you do, Kyle. I love you. You're doing great stuff. I've talked to you in person many times. I've told you when you made mistakes. No NFC on the OnePlus 2. Hello. God, me and Andrew Martinick took him to the cleaners on that one. We're like, how cute, how dare you? He's like, I didn't realize NFC was such a big deal in the US where, this is way before, this is a decade ago. But now he got it after that. We never lacked NFC on any flagship OnePlus phone.
I just got to say, as somebody who's into watches and knows that occasionally you will find a watch with a transparent background, that there's a very good reason for having transparency on something when you can show people something that is beautiful.
Yeah.
What about the inside of a phone is
It's not
beautiful?
beautiful.
Like that's why I don't get it. But I do think your point about saving money, creating a much more affordable device because you're not spending a lot of money on expensive materials and machining. Maybe it's almost like port or something, and it just has a slot and everything slides in and clamps. That could be an innovation. And here's the thing, $500 is not the innovation. Give me a $99 5G phone.
Yes.
And suddenly everything changes. That is a game changer. But I feel like
he's not going there.
He's not going there, right?
No, because he's a technologist like you and me. He has a standard set of expectations. And I think he understands that the people who follow him are the X1 Plus early adopters and tech-savvy folks to a great extent. And they are expecting a certain thing. And remember, India, right? We have to not forget. And this is the thing, my podcast, the reason we're going to cover some Chinese phones today is because my podcast has an audience in India and in Australia and in English-speaking parts of Asia, like the Philippines and Hong Kong, etc. And I cover the Chinese phones extensively and the Indian phones extensively because they bring so much value to the table. And this is another market that I know for sure. This is not a phone made for you and me, Lance. It's not made for the US. It's not made for even Europe, even though they're based in London. And, he has Teenage Engineering from Sweden involved. It's a phone made for those markets. It's going to be made for that. Indian market, which is super spec sensitive and price sensitive. And that's actually reassuring to me because, we're hearing rumors of a OnePlus Nord N25G, which we'll discuss later. And I think that phone is going to be great for the US, but it's going to be a joke compared price-wise and spec-wise to what I'm getting when I look at Xiaomi phones or Realme phones that are coming into my desk,
Right, right. I mean, I think that's a really important part of the conversation is which market you're going after because it is different, and the perspective in the U.S. is very iPhone centric, and Samsung,
and Samsung.
but it's iPhone, it's Samsung, and then all the other stuff is just kind of barely on the radar. OnePlus has designs on becoming much more prominent here in the U.S., but
Google as well is finally
Google,
maybe
yes,
making a dent with the 6 series.
I think they are, but I feel like they're still. It's weird because Google seems to be a little bit lost about the Pixel identity. I think that there's a little bit more focus now. Yeah, I know, and they've made so many sort of left turn, right turn, left turn, right turn. I do think that with this 6 that it's starting to get some refinement. I'm not a big fan of the design. I think they went bold,
but it's unique and you can see it. I saw one in New York City.
Yes.
Yesterday, I was in town for just a night, and I was like, "Oh, look at that! A Pixel 6 in the wild." I wasn't the 6 Pro. I could tell them apart because I'm a nerd. But like, you look at an Oppo or OnePlus today. From a distance, you have to really get a little closer.
And it's difficult. It's an excellent point. Excellent point, Miriam, because really what's happening here is Google identified that one of the ways to make a mark is to differentiate yourself from the pack. And that is super hard unless you do something, a bigger swing on the design side. So I don't like the band. I don't like how it looks. But I think you're 100% right that at least from even a distance, if somebody has that phone, you're like, oh, that's the Pixel. Huh. And that's so important because people once every 24 to 12 to 24 months are in that upgrade cycle. They're looking, and they do tend to go from iPhone to iPhone, but sometimes they start to take a bigger look. And if they're on the Android side, everything's open to them. But at the same time, they're generally going to Samsung, maybe Google. But then the other brands you talked about just don't play here.
Actually, that's the other thing, right? We don't even get those, right? Like, it's no point in saying how Xiaomi phones and Redmi, which is their sub-brand, and Poco are similar looking from a distance when you can't even get them. I mean, you can, but nobody's going to get them.
No, nobody's going to get them.
But, I think the interesting thing you brought up here to me is that design matters. And I think that's what, in my OnePlus 10 Pro review for Hot Hardware, I said, this is a design that stands out. Like, I like it because it gives OnePlus finally a unique identity. There you go.
Yeah.
And I feel, and I love that case, by the way. I know as well. I even took a photo in the case for my review because I thought that case was so dope. But, in the past, like, the Oppification of OnePlus is way older than people think. Like, having had the Oppo phones side by side with the OnePlus phones for the last 2-3 years, I can tell you, like, there are some previous OnePlus phones where you would swear they were, and they actually, if you look at the specs, they're rebranded Oppos oftentimes and vice versa, right? And this upcoming one that we're hearing that we're going to discuss is also, it looks like a rebranded either a Realme or an Oppo. And that's one of the reasons I dinged the N10 5G last year, is that the N10 5G was blatantly an Oppo phone in its design and its specs. Now, it didn't matter in North America, but for those of us who knew, we were like, come on, like, are you serious? Like, this is cheap and dirty. And also, it wasn't really aesthetically very pleasing, but they heard us. And this is what I like about OnePlus. They heard us, and the N200 5G last year really stood out. I mean, it still fit in the Oppo zeitgeist of design, but it did have that OnePlusness. It had that you could see it and say, oh, this is that affordable T-Mobile OnePlus phone that's really great. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And
I got to give them kudos for like listening at least.
They listen to some things, but then I just asked them last week, I said, why did you remove macro photography? It's like, well, nobody cared about
I
it.
tell you why, because the 150-degree lens does not support the ability to make an autofocus mechanism because of Z-depth. It's just physics. Like, I ding them on that too. Like, I know that on one hand, yes, it's nice to have this 150-degree lens.
Yeah.
But the sensor they had to put under there is a lesser sensor than last year's IMX766 on the 9 and 9 Pro. And because of that, you lose autofocus. And so it's either you get the 150 degree and, you get this great opportunity to do fisheye and stuff, or you get the macro and you get a better low light sensor. And they chose one thing.
Yeah, and I think that was, to me, a mistake. It's also weird
Me too.
because 150 is not enabled by default.
No,
So
that's
you
the
start
irony.
with 120,
I know.
and a lot of users are never going to see the 150 because they don't go into settings.
It's buried in the menus. I know.
And it's like it doesn't make sense. And I always, I wrote a story recently about macro photography on iPhone because they just did this awards thing. And,
right.
and I
remember
talked
that.
about how, the first place I had smartphone macro photography was on a OnePlus, and now it's
Yeah.
gone. And
Yeah.
I thought for me that was a differentiator. Why give up something that is, part of your DNA? But they just kind of discarded it. It was like, in favor of what? Somebody said that it would be cool to do fisheye photography. Fisheye photography is useful exactly how often?
So I think if you zoom back, Lance, it's actually very interesting. There are 3 phones right now. Well, let's say there are 4 phones that are relevant in this conversation. There's 5. Oh boy, this is growing. Okay, OnePlus 10 Pro, OnePlus 9 Pro previously, Oppo Find X5 Pro, which is the current flagship from Oppo, and Oppo Find X3 Pro last year. And then the 5th phone in this story is the Realme GT2 Pro. All these are flagships. 2 of them are last year's. Realme's current flagship, get this, is got the microscope lens from the Oppo Find X3 Pro last year, the crazy 20 magnification and digital zoom 40 magnification microscope, which is great. A lot of people had a lot of fun with that lens last year. And that was on the Oppo Find X3 Pro, which was a very expensive flagship from Oppo last year. Then you have the Realme has the 150 degree ultra wide that we found in the OnePlus 10 Pro. And then the main sensors on all of these phones, except the OnePluses, are and the ultra wides on the 9 series of OnePlus are the excellent IMX766 sensor from Sony. So what I'm trying to get to is it's a part spinning exercise.
Yeah.
They have these bins with the microscope lens, the 150 degree lens, the IMX766 ultra wide, and the IMX766 main. And then for the 9 Pro, 10 Pro, they have that very bespoke IMX789 sensor, which is a really, really nice sensor. And they just pick and choose, and they make phones out of that. And it's literally what we got. It's like somebody that's like puppeteering at Oppo, Realme, OnePlus was like, I think the OnePlus gets the 150 degrees this year. And I don't understand why. I just know that Xiaomi is like that. Like they literally have these part spins and they pick like their screens and their like cameras and even the chassis sometimes have the power lock key, the SIM slot, and the volume rocker in the same place. It's insane. But you know what? It streamlines their operation. Right? Exactly. And that's what they became very known for. Right. Like some phones are literally the same across 2 brands because they're sold in different markets, Philippines versus India. And they have different branding expectations because those are the brands they're more familiar with. But Xiaomi is like, well, this phone has the specs that both markets need. So we're just going to like give a different back panel, different color job, and slightly different software. And they're going to be exactly the same specs on paper.
I mean, obviously, this goes back to the region discussion that they have to be sort of choosing those parts from these bins based on markets, right? Based on what they think is going to work best in some markets.
100%.
That calculation they made on going to 150 degree ultra wide and removing and giving up macro. Definitely seems to be in part that, at least in the US, they didn't find a lot of people really into macro photography, but everybody's trying to get everyone into the shot. There's more of that. So maybe it's a better story.
I mean, it could also just be that they thought this would be a cool feature for this audience, right? Like, and by putting that feature in, they knew they couldn't do autofocus. And they're like, well, we gain some, you lose some. And, I'm not quite sure that it's like Tesla who, when they had supply chain issues, removed the lumbar support on the Model 3 on the passenger side to save a bit of money, because that way they now had double the amount of lumbar support for the driver's side. And it made sense. We didn't like it as Tesla people, but it made sense. At the same time, Elon, when asked, said, well, we did looked at the stats. Very few people use the lumbar on the passenger side, and we had to do something because we were low on supply. So we did that. I don't think OnePlus is looking at those numbers. I'm not sure. Like, they might have access to some data around that, but this is more like, this is a cool feature. What do we give the North American market they haven't seen before? And Lance, to be honest, we would have nailed OnePlus as reviewers if they had delivered the Sony IMX766 ultra wide with the autofocus. Because then, listen, they would have delivered the exact same camera system as last year on the 9 Pro.
Right.
Exact same, to the actual microscopic level, same. And then, somebody would have been cranky about that. So they're like, okay, let's do something.
It's funny how much of the work they do is catering to us, and how much of it is, consumers who couldn't care less. I mean, we have consumers walking around. I'll give you one quick example. There was an incredible rainbow in New York City just last week. I mean, just a top 10 like you've never seen before.
Mm-hmm.
You could see the beginning and the end of it. My son driving on a train caught it with his iPhone 8, and they were great pictures. And then I saw online, there was somebody who tweeted, the best camera you have is the one that's in your pocket. And they had taken the shot with an iPhone 6.
Yeah.
And then I thought, they're still walking around with an iPhone 6? But that's because, one, consumers are, they don't always have the money for a new phone. And they're like,
some don't
this
care.
camera seems good enough.
Yeah, some don't care. Like, I know that some don't care. I see it all the time. It's just we live in a bubble in a way, right?
Yeah.
But
true.
at the same time, you're right. Us media are and I see that in car world, as the audience knows, I do a lot of the car reviews for the US for Tick Radar. And I talk to the other journalists, and it's the same thing. We're like, well, we want this. And then the manufacturer's like, well, we're just going to be accommodating 10 people, right? And they're kind of right. Like, it's true, right?
Well, I just wrote an article about how I really, really want on the iPhone 14, I want this periscope zoom,
Well,
like
that needs to happen. They're so behind on that.
Yeah, but it does. It does. It is my number one thing because I'm such a nut about getting close to stuff. And I lost my mind with the Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra because
it's so good.
It's not just the 10, because what I was saying is that you've got the 10x optical zoom, and that's incredible. They use the periscope, but then you put on top of that the algorithms to go to the 30x space and 100x space. And the only way that's possible is if you have the foundation of the 10x optical zoom. So where's Apple in this? And we have this tiny little hint that maybe they're getting closer, but I'm desperate for that.
You're not going to get 2 telephotos from Apple. What I see happening, and also I'm not sure they'll go for a folded lens right away. I see them putting, they went to a 3x zoom on the 13 Pro,
I
right?
know.
Pro Max. But there's a big gap if you go 5x periscope or 4x periscope. Now, on the Pixel, that's addressed by super res zoom, which there's, sub-pixel interpolation based on the motion of your hand, which is very smart, which, by the way, Samsung's doing as well, and others are doing now too.
Yeah, it's a good job of it.
I don't know if Apple has it, but they could easily implement it. I mean, they have the oomph, the money, the people to do it. The big question is, if they do that, they need to go to a large megapixel pixel bin sensor. And that's the other thing that we think is going to happen. I could see them doing to a 48, 50, 64, 108 megapixel sensor.
Oh, it's 100% time for them to do it. I can't believe they haven't
and
yet.
Then a 5x or 4x folded lens. But here's the thing, right? They could also do this. They could do a 3x folded lens if the large sensor underneath it. The reason normally the folded lenses start at 5x if you have normal size non-bin sensors, because again, the Z depth, right? So they fold it and it works.
Yes.
But on a 3x telephoto, usually if your sensor is 12, 10, 8 megapixel, normal pixel size is like 1.12 microns, 1.2, 1.4 even microns, you can do a, normal telephoto lens. But on the Pixel, the reason it's a 4x folded, which is unusual, right? It's because it's a 48 megapixel sensor under there. So now they couldn't do Z-depth wise a non-folded setup for that. But I think that's what we want. We don't want to jump to a large magnification optically, because then you kind of get that middle, all the portraits and stuff, things that really require high quality photos are lost in the middle somewhere, right? At 12, if you zoom 2x on the iPhone right now, it's a little crunchy because you're not quite at the telephoto yet, but you're also on a 12 megapixel sensor, a good one, but you're losing some data.
Right. I mean, they have the best image interpolation of really anybody in the business. They've innovated a lot in those areas. A lot of people have followed behind them, but for some reason, they've been on an incremental path for like 5 years. And it is, if they don't do it with the 14, then the iPhone 15, which of course, go with the number 15, so they could do something that does in fact really change the camera array. You can't just keep making the lenses bigger and switching around your stovetop shape. That's not going to be enough. We expect more from them, and they will have been able to learn so much from everybody who's come before them, who has been doing this, who has already upped their megapixels and is working with binning and is folding their lenses. And Apple, in typical Apple fashion, always looks at that and goes, great. Now, how do we go the next level? And suddenly they're leading and everybody else is chasing. It's time for Apple to do it. I can't believe that I'm saying that we're sitting here and they haven't, but within this year or the next, it's got to happen.
It is, and it is a real estate hog to do a folded lens in terms of space inside the phone.
It is.
But it does bring some other advantages that a lot of people don't realize, is because it's a prism setup for the mirroring of the path of the optical path. That those prisms can be mounted on micromagnets and become used for optical image stabilization. So you no longer you actually have more sophisticated options for your image stabilization, like optical stabilization, than you do on a regular lens. And that's kind of another thing that I think Apple innovated, and Oppo just followed suit with the Find X5 Pro, is in-body stabilization, where the sensor itself moves.
Yes.
Oppo went one level further by combining in-body stabilization with the lens. So the lens and the sensor can both move, which gives them an opportunity to keep lens aberrations to a minimum, which I think is incredible. And you can actually see the result of it. It's one of the best camera systems for the main sensor of any camera today, right now on the market. And notice that nobody else has that. Like Oppo kept that for the Find X5 Pro. They're not part spinning that system to any other BBK Group device. Now, Vivo, which is another BBK Group company, but it's a little bit more off to the side doing its own thing, has been doing some pretty crazy gimbal-based stabilization, where the entire camera system in the phone is mounted on a gimbal and suspended there, and it works. Holy tell you, especially for video, it's really good.
I mean, isn't it crazy what people can now fit inside of these devices? You're just like, there's no end to it.
It's incredible.
Any mechanical device that you could see in the real world and maybe hold in your hand can be shrunk down to the micron size and shoved inside a phone. I was going to say, by the way, that I think it's Jawa is the name. JAHWA is the company that makes some of the modules that you're talking about, which include autofocus and optical image stabilization.
That's right.
That part manufacturer is likely the one that Apple might be working with to finally get periscope style technology. But the rumor is, just because it's obviously just a rumor, they met with Apple, gave them a grand tour, but then separately the company said we're spending like 191 billion won on a new production facility to build some new device, but obviously no details on it. So we decided to connect the dots on that. But that's the thing. If you can think it, they can do it. And I look to Apple to sort of innovate in that area. But obviously, the reality is, I mean, you know this better than most, that so much of the oddball and interesting and pushing the limits innovation has come on the Android side from these guys who don't have.
I know, and it's like, I hate the fact that people go on and on about Apple. I'm like, guys, like what Vivo's doing right now is cutting edge.
That's pretty crazy.
That is crazy. Cutting edge. And they're on the third generation. This is 3 years of them doing this now.
I know we were supposed to talk about that, and I was looking at that technology because the Fold What's so interesting to me about folding technology, folding screens, is that in my head, I was like, well, yeah, it's a flexible display, but you can never quite get like that smoothness. And when I saw Samsung's first effort, I was like, yeah, you see,
Yeah.
you can't do it. And they tried really hard, and then they made a terrible hinge the first time out, and they had to fix it and literally create a sweeping system inside a hinge to fix it. That's what they did.
Yep.
Craziest thing ever. But I was looking at what Vivo did. And that whole sort of mechanical, where the center is sort of floating and then comes
Pops
up and
up.
creates
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
perfect plane. Now, I have
Platform.
not, maybe you've seen it in person. I have
No,
not.
I haven't seen that. Even Oppo's Find N, which is essentially, the same parent company, which is a fantastic phone, by the way. It's much smaller than a Z Fold 3. So when it's closed, it's the size of an iPhone 13 mini. And you open it up
Sweet.
and it gives you much more real estate than, not a huge amount more than a large, like almost 7-inch normal non-folding phone. In case you're wondering, folks, we're talking about the Vivo X Fold, which is the folding phone that was rumored, we talked about last week as a rumor, is now officially being revealed. And the thing is, the hinge is very unique, and the camera system is again, Vivo's best. And it's, got like a folded periscope lens. And I don't know if it has the gimbal on this one, but it definitely has the Zeiss optics, which are T-Star coded and stuff. But the wild card for Apple for this folded lens, if they do one, is what Sony did with the Xperia 1 Mark III and the Xperia 5 Mark III. They did a folded lens that had two zoom levels. So inside that mechanism, it could move it to one, like not continuously, but it could go one setting or another.
Right.
And so they basically did what Samsung does, but with 3 openings instead of 4, right? Because one was a 2.2x and the other one was a 4.5x or something like that. And it's a cool proof of concept. There is a drawback. The f-stops on those lenses are not in the same league as what Samsung's delivering with dedicated lenses.
Right.
And so, you need a bigger sensor because of low light, blah, blah, blah. So I'm not sure Apple will compromise that way. Also, moving parts, you have to worry about. Sony doesn't sell a lot of phones. If it breaks, it breaks. Whereas Apple, at their scale, they need to maintain, they need to make sure that stuff is reliable.
I mean, one of the reasons they don't do things first sometimes is that they don't want to be in the sort of proof of concept phase. They want to be in the reliability phase. When haptics started showing up on phones, they didn't show up immediately on iPhones and other products that Apple made because, they would just figure out how to make these tiny motors that could deliver those bumps, the response that you would feel.
But they refined it because they did it better than everyone else.
That's right.
And then everyone else is following suit now.
Yeah, but isn't that Apple's way?
Totally is. Absolutely.
It's what they do. Sit back, wait, let everybody make their mistakes, then really peel apart all the technology and go, yeah, we can definitely do this better. And that's how they do their bespoke. It's always bespoke. It's like they say, yeah, that's nice that you build that for all these other people. Now, here's how we'd like you to build it for us. And so it's always special.
Yeah, it's really interesting you bring up the vibration motor. It's such a simple thing. I don't know if your audience knows, but a vibration motor at its base, back in the days of pagers in the 90s, that's what Motorola invented, the vibration motor. And it's really just a tiny little cylindrical motor, a brushed DC motor, tiny, tiny one, with a counterweight mounted on the shaft. And it has stronger bearings because the counterweight is going to cause some stress on the thing. And then it rotates. And because the mass is counterweight, it just wobbles, and the whole device that it's attached to firmly wobbles, and you hear vibration, you feel vibration. So that's why you have that. But for the longest time, that was that. Then somebody said, hey, let's make a linear motor. A linear motor is a motor that, instead of spinning, moves, along an axis. And if you put springs at the ends of that linear motor and you actuate the magnets that are surrounding it, you can get the mass that's attached to that motor to move in one direction. So now you have springs at the end. So imagine you move in one direction, then you move in the other direction, and all of a sudden you have a mass moving back and forth. And that's what the linear motor does, which is what we have in all of our modern flagships. Cheaper phones still use the rotational crappy motors. If you have a cheaper Android phone and it kind of feels a little crappy vibrating, that's because you get the old motor. But most, I would say anything over $400 nowadays uses a linear motor. And so Android invented that. They did that. I don't know who it was, but they did that. And then Apple was like, wait a minute, you guys are completely missing the point here. Now that we have fine motor control because it's a linear motor and there's no brushes, essentially a brushless DC linear motor, we can very carefully with a controlled waveform control the magnets to get any kind of motion we want. So we can have like impulse responses that corresponds to tapping on a trackpad or giving you a little knock on your wrist on your watch. And that's how we got the Taptic engine, what Apple called. And then everyone was like, wait a minute, we can do that too. There's no copyright on this. It's literally just applying waveforms to a motor. And then look at it where we are now. I think we're really nerding out, Lance. This is good. This is exactly what this podcast
But
is about.
it's so true. It's so fascinating because I literally remember a guy coming into my office and showing me an early like an early product with haptic response in it. And I was like, I was fascinated because it was creating a feeling that didn't actually exist. And now we just take it all for granted. We all just
I
expect.
mean, the thing about haptics, having a linear motor, you can now create that weird buzz that you feel. You don't, it's kind of more like a rough surface on the glass. That is actually haptics on a linear. You cannot do that with a rotational motor at all. There's no control to that. But you can actually make it so that, you know when sometimes you have a metal laptop and it's plugged into a non-grounded outlet and you sometimes feel that little bit of current that's going through the laptop because it's not grounded properly. All computers experience that. It's not dangerous. It's just like stray current going through the thing. And it feels like when you're touching it, kind of feels like a tickle almost. That can be replicated with a linear haptic motor, which is incredible, and which is what Apple does with some stuff that they're doing on their watches and their phones. And then the rest of the world has been like doing it too. Like I think OnePlus is a good example of really good linear motors on their phones. Samsung, I think, went a little backwards with the S22 series because instead of mounting the motor horizontally in the plane of the phone, they mounted it vertically for space reasons, but it feels different. It feels different.
Yeah, that's going to kill some of the response. By the way, well, thanks for joining us on Haptic Talk.
Yes, welcome to Haptic Talk. So I just want to kind of go back to a couple of things. So the first thing is, for me, wrapping up the nothing conversation, I don't expect this to be more than essentially a OnePlus Nord kind of phone, but with some really cool design. And you're going to get it. Some people are going to love it. If they can deliver this with a good Android experience, kudos to them. Can they survive? No, I don't know, because look at Robin Nextbit, right? Remember that? Nextbit Robin? They also delivered a cool designed phone with some cool features, and they got bought by Razer, right? And then becomes the Razer phones after that. So I think, to me, if Calpay is trying to sell the company, good. I think that's going to work. But I think that if you folks think that nothing's going to stick around, be its own thing like OnePlus did, you have to understand OnePlus was part of BBK Group. It was huge. They had the runway, all the runway in the world to keep going. And here they are now. They've been reabsorbed into the mothership. They were let free for a while. They did their thing and they're being pulled back. And I don't think this is going to happen with nothing because they're an independent company. So the only end game I see for them is they make a couple of great phones, a few more earbuds, maybe a watch and a smartwatch. And then they get bought by, OnePlus or whatever it might be. And that's fine. But if you think we're going to see like that whole hype about Apple ecosystem, like none of that's going to happen.
No.
I mean, you can install your Tesla app and your Apple Music app on your Nothing phone and enjoy some integration with the Apple and Tesla ecosystem. But what are they going to do beyond that?
Yeah. And ultimately, to succeed, you have to inspire consumers and you have to inspire them at scale. And that is how phone companies win. That's how Apple won. That's how Samsung is winning. You have to turn on enough people who get excited by either some essence of the device, some specific feature, and I think that's going to be incredibly difficult to do. And an oddball design, semi-transparent design, is not the kind of inspiration that people are looking for. Because it's going to be a kludge. It's not going to be like what we saw in sci-fi, what we've seen on any number of sci-fi films and movies where they're literally holding what looks like a pane of glass that is also a phone. Because that's what we want. And if you deliver that...
It's coming. One day we'll get it. I'm sure it'll happen.
I'm sure we will too, but it's not going to be... I mean, I don't want... Because that's a whole other path I think about it all the time because I'm always running into, you watch a show and there it is. And then my head starts spinning about the how and what things have to be made transparent and where the power source has to be and how they can be unbreakable.
Oh, I know. You're the same as me. I do the same thing. It's crazy.
Yeah, you can't help it.
Yeah. So let's go through some news items so we can get it out of the way and maybe have a few minutes spent on the Apple Pro discussion. So quickly, we talked about the Vivo phone. I just want to give you some specs, folks, so you have an idea what's going on. Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, of course. This has a dual 120 hertz refresh rate display. Interestingly, the front display is 21:9, which is a nice aspect ratio, like the Oppo Find N. And basically, but just bigger. This is more like the size of a Z Fold 3. And I like that. It's not a variable rate. I mean, it's a fixed, 60, 90, 120 hertz in the front, but the inside is a variable rate display. 120 hertz, of course. And it has cameras. Well, it has a Samsung GN5 sensor, which is the biggest 50 megapixel sensor that Samsung makes, which is also, I think, the sensor on the Pixel 6 Pro. And on some older Vivo, it's one of the best low light sensors in the world. It comes with f/1.75, which is pretty good, and has optical image stabilization. So no gimbal on this one, but hey, 48 megapixel ultra wide and a 12 megapixel portrait. They like to have a dedicated portrait lens as a 2x, generally not stabilized, but for portraits, it's really nice to have an exact kind of 50 millimeter equivalent on a phone that can just portray away all day long. Vivo's been doing this for a long time. And then, of course, because that's not enough cameras yet, we've got an 8 megapixel 5x optical stabilized periscope telephoto, because, let's not mess about.
Yeah.
Metal and glass construction. This thing has got two front-facing cameras, one on the main screen, one on the front screen.
When it's folded, how thick is it? Because that's always my concern with the folded phones.
I don't have dimensions here. Let me see. I'm looking at Richard Lai's article on Engadget. He went a little deeper than we did at Tech Radar. And I don't see dimensions, unfortunately. But it has that cool hinge. Weight's it's a pretty heavy thing. It weighs 311 grams.
I did see that it's reliable in that it's going to be like, 10 years of folding and unfolding.
Yeah, that stuff, like, sure, okay, I believe it. You better, sorry, but, here the resolution, 2160 by 1916 for the inside panel.
Okay, unfolded, that's the
what's it called, LTPO E5 panel from Samsung, the one that's on the S22 Ultra as well. And then 66 watt wired and 50 watt wireless charging. Of course, because, why not? Because China is always like that. They just give us like this crazy fast charging for everything. I mean, this is cool. I think it's going to be, Vivo is pretty high end in terms of their pricing and stuff. 12 gigs of RAM, 256 gigs of storage for $1,410. Not bad for a folding phone with those specs.
Yeah. I mean, again, I've yet to see a single folding phone out in the wild of any brand. And I feel like the ones that look the most like a flip phone that people remember, and because there's a whole nostalgia retro thing going on in the market right now, people looking at some older stuff. But if you can combine sort of the cutting edge with the nostalgia, which is really a flip phone, then you have something. And I haven't seen enough like that I think the Galaxy Fold Z Flip 3, was probably my favorite for that fact that even though it's wider and it's not really quite as much like a flip as I'd want, but nobody is quite getting to that. So we've got these sort of weird, sort of longer, thinner, and then they open into almost like a square. And if you want a phone and not a tablet, why are you doing that? You know what I'm saying? It's like there's such a specific market for these phones. That's why they can get away with charging like $1,500 for them, because they're for this sort of upscale, narrowly targeted market. But it's very much aspirational technology. We're still in the stage of figuring this stuff out. That's why I was so fixated on Vivo's folding solution, because
the hinge,
once again, it's another look at how we can do the hinge better, because until this is perfect, consumers are going to be like, I want to take the risk.
I'm not really sure of the utility of a phone that folds into a tablet. The Oppo Find N to me was interesting that way because it didn't pretend to be a tablet. I mean, it was bigger when open, but it just behaved like a smartphone. So, you just got more screen real estate. And then you closed it and it was the size of an iPhone mini that was a little thicker. And that was appealing because if you had a very simple, and the front screen is full front screen. So you can actually use it. It's actually wider than the front screen on the Z Fold 3, but not as tall. So you can actually use it if you have to on a pinch and then you switch over. The next thing we have on here is just really a PSA for the community. The RedMagic 7 Pro is out. That's been out in China for a while. The global model is out. So those of you in the US can now buy it because it's actually sold and supported in the US with 5G bands for the US, like the 7 was. And the difference between the 7 and 7 Pro is that the 7 Pro has an under-display camera and for the front and has a 108 megapixel rear camera sensor. But basically, they're the same phone. They're a gaming phone, Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, shoulder buttons, built-in fan with RGB lighting, of course. And I reviewed it, so check them out. Not the Pro, but the 7 on Hot Hardware. Check it out. But it's, there's really not much to say other than if you're a gamer and you're waiting for the better RedMagic, it's out now. And then let's see, we've got Pixel 6a. Yeah, so Pixel 6a went through the FCC, which just tells us that it's coming soon. I think we're going to see this at Google I/O, right? What do you think?
that makes sense. I mean, even if it won't be much of a mention. It'll be kind of like, this is something new we got because the focus of Google I/O is always sort of eye-popping, algorithmic and AI-based technology.
Totally.
Something, now it can not only make a hair appointment for you, but it can tell you how you were feeling about your haircut afterwards. It's like that kind of stuff.
You remember that phone call to the hairdresser?
I remember it
my
so
God,
clearly.
That was hilarious.
So clearly.
Oh, yeah. Another thing you should know, we talked earlier about switching from iPhone to Android. That doesn't happen very often, apparently, but it happens often enough that there's a leak of a switch to Android, that's what it's called, app from Google. So Tech Radar wrote about this. Those of you who dare to switch from an iPhone to an Android phone, I applaud your daringness, or whatever the word is. I applaud your willingness to try this, but there will be an app to help you because this is definitely one of the biggest challenges right now.
Yeah, it sure is. It's about time that they got to this. It's been easier going the other way.
Exactly. So the last thing we kind of touched on, and I want to kind of elaborate just a little more on this one, is it's been confirmed now that on April 21st, OnePlus is having some sort of announcement in India for a phone that has had multiple names now. I believe it's going to be called the 10R. So the R series is India only, and it's always been basically they've taken, I believe when the 8R came, or the 8R or the 9R. One of those came out. It was essentially a OnePlus 8T rebranded and like with a newer processor, but the chassis and the cameras and everything was the same. So I'm not sure if this is here the same. This looks more like they're actually taking a Realme phone and rebranding it. And the only takeaway here that you really have to worry about, the only thing that matters is that this has potentially the first OnePlus phone with 150 watt charging, which they promised at MWC. So it looks like a reskinned Realme GT Neo 3, which is the newest Realme mid-rangers. And this is going to be, it might have been called the OnePlus Ace, and there might be a new line under the Ace branding, but that looks like no, because the invite to the OnePlus thing says OnePlus 10R. So anyway, Ace or 10R, this is going to be a rebranded, reskinned Realme GT Neo 3. But it has the distinction of having 150 watt charging. And it's India only for now, as far as I know, or the rest of the world only. We're not going to see this in the US or the West at all. No. So keep your ears peeled if you're in those markets and you're curious about what OnePlus has got, what Ace they have under their sleeve. Yes, I did it. No, but I think what's interesting here is that, this part spinning, right? Like, remember part spinning? There we go. This is 100% part spinning. 6.7 inch AMOLED. We've got a Dimensity 8100 in there. This phone's already been released. It's out. It's, 50 megapixel Sony IMX766 main sensor, probably without OIS on this one because they do both with and without. And like a 2 megapixel macro camera, which I call a sticker cam, might as well be a sticker because it's so useless. It's typical what we expect. But at the same time, this 150 watt charging, I think, is exciting because in these markets, I've reviewed the Xiaomi phones with 120 watt charging. You're in India, you might not have reliable power at your home. You're taking the train back, from work to your home, and you have a train station has an outlet. You plug in for 5 minutes before your train arrives, and you get like 50, 30, 40% of your battery life back. And with a big 5,000 milliamp hour battery, you're going to get, enough juice to hold you for a day for just charging those 5 minutes in the train station. In those markets, it makes perfect sense, right?
Yeah. It's exciting to have that kind of charging speed, although you wonder how hot the phone gets. But
Well, they've managed do a pretty good job. I think the 120 watt one I use was surprisingly cool while charging. I think they're the battery chemistry they're using is kind of the latest state of the art used in EVs, and then they're using some really, really cool, like not cool in temperature, but cool in terms of tech. Battery management, also inherited from EVs. And they're doing some very careful AI-based, actually, current and voltage monitoring to get the battery to just be at its peak all the time.
Well, Apple does that too with they use the AI to manage the battery.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're even guaranteeing over 1,000 charge cycles on these at high speed, which is pretty incredible. So I believe them. I think that the days of the Note 7 lighting up on fire are behind us. I think this has become such a priority for companies.
Well, it is. I will say, and I don't want to. I know we're running short on time, but very briefly, my OnePlus 9 Pro phone I really enjoyed.
Yeah,
I picked it up because I was preparing to look at the OnePlus 10 Pro, and I noticed that the case was sticking out of the case. Turned out it had expanded and popped the case. The battery had expanded so much it popped the case. That's
actually pretty unusual for a 1-year-old phone. I've had this happen on phones that were in storage for like 3 years or something.
Yeah.
Especially Sony phones. Sorry, Sony guys. But now that I've mentioned the Note 7 again, that's it. Samsung's going to be bad at me. It's going to call me up.
Look,
every time I mention it,
it's
I
not
get
your
like
fault. It's
could
not
you
your
not,
fault.
Could you
it
not
happened.
say
It was
that?
real. And by the way, this happened to me on 2 Google Pixel 3 XLs. Over the last like 3 or 4 years. It's just a weird,
It happens.
It does happen. It does happen more than people think. But yes. So in any case, the last thing I'll say about the 150 watt charger is it is another great example of Android sort of innovating before Apple.
Yeah, a lot of you might say, well, this is stupid. I don't need it. Yeah, you don't need it because you live in the West and you charge every night and you have a regular lifestyle that lets you do that. But in some markets, that's super important. That's more important than wireless charging that I feel is critical,
Yeah.
So, just everybody's got different needs. So let's not dismiss that. I think that we will eventually converge to a point where every flagship can charge at over 100 watts and it'll just be a normal thing.
I think so, sure.
And you just might choose to charge at 5 watts. Or you'll be like using an old iPhone Square adapter, with this state-of-the-art Android phone. Then it'll be like puttering along, happily doing its thing. Oh, man, we live in a crazy world. Anyway, Lance, we should wrap up. Do you want to tell folks where they can find you on the internet?
Certainly. Obviously, I'm U.S. Editor-in-Chief of Tech Radar, so you can find stories by me there. I also write occasionally on Medium. You can find some stories there. And always find me on Twitter at Lance Ulanoff.
That's right. So, folks, follow Lance on Twitter and hit us up, the both of us, on Twitter if you want to comment on the podcast, ask some questions. I'm at Tankgirl on Twitter. That's TNKGRL, like the comic book character, but drop the vowels. And that's my Twitter handle. Also, my Instagram handle if you want to see pretty pictures of phones, pretty pictures of cars, pretty pictures taken with phones, because I do all my photos with phones mostly. Go check out my Instagram. And then, of course, the podcast lives at mobiletechpodcast.com. We're on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Spotify, everywhere good podcasts can be found. There's also an RSS feed at that URL if you want to go the old school way. And if your app lets you review or rate the show, please consider doing that. That would be really helpful. There is a couple of YouTube channels related to the podcast, youtube.com/mobiletechpodcast and youtube.com/mobiletechmore. Both of them are basically visuals to go along with the podcast. You get the phones, the earbuds, the smartwatches, the immediate personal tech peripherals to the phone on the main channel. And on Mobile Tech More, you get the home automation, car smart tech, travel tech, all the stuff that's peripheral but still touches your everyday smartphone life. So you know how YouTube works, right? Like, subscribe, click the notification icon, tell your friends, comment. You can comment about the actual audio podcast on there. I'll answer. It's cool. I don't mind. And then, of course, we have a Patreon. I mentioned it earlier. If you want to see this podcast and see our faces and see us handle the devices, we don't do a lot of handling, but a little bit. You can subscribe to the Patreon. There's a tier for the video version, which comes out a little earlier than the audio version. It's also less edited. You know, I don't go all crazy. I give you a bit more of the raw experience as if you were there. So that's for you. Check it out. There is also a Discord server that lets you chat with me. That's one of the tiers. There's a bunch of tiers. Look at it, patreon.com/tankgirl. That's patreon.com/TNKGRL. If you can afford doing that, you know, please help us out. This is how we make this podcast happen, through your help with Patreon. And then if you don't like Patreon and you want to support financially, I get it. There's another option. There is a PayPal link in the show notes. You can click through there and make a donation. Buy me a coffee, buy me lunch, whatever it might be. It also helps. So yeah, thanks for the patrons that we have, and thanks for joining if you're considering it. I appreciate it. And I want to thank our sponsor, Esper, this week. Esper is the world's only DevOps for device platform. Esper powers the unseen world of Android, the world of dedicated devices. Everything from point-of-sale terminals to exercise equipment to mission-critical communications handsets for first responders. Check out esper.io and book a demo today. And I want to thank David again for being my guest, and of course, Lance. Thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. We'll have you on again at some point in the future. And folks, you know we'll have another show next week, so stay tuned for that. Until then, cheers, everybody.
This has been the Mobile Tech Podcast with Tank Girl, proudly presented by worldpodcasts.com. You can visit us online at mobiletechpodcast.com.